Margaery Tyrell stood on the balcony of the Red Keep and gazed out across a city she hardly recognized. The sun was low in the sky, painting the towers and winding streets of King's Landing in red and gold. Even the reek rising from the slums took on a strangely burnished hue under that dying light. To Margaery's mind, it felt as if the city itself was at a crossroads between shadow and splendor, poised to fall wholly into the dark or ascend into something bright and new. She wondered which path it would take, and whether she had the power to guide it. A soft breeze whispered around her, rustling her long auburn curls. She wore a gown of pale green, with gold accents woven into the sleeves. It had been a gift from her grandmother, the Queen of Thorns, who had always believed that appearance was one of a woman's greatest weapons. If Margaery could project grace, confidence, and charm, she might succeed where so many before her had failed in winning the hearts of the people, and in bending them to her will. Below, in the courtyard, Loras Tyrell sparred with 3 young men at once, all an attempt to distract himself from the bitterness of what had been done to him under Cersei's manipulations. He was stripped of his Kingsguard position for rumor and innuendo, indicted before the faith by fanatics whose loyalties had been swayed by Queen Cersei's gold, and humiliated in a trial that stripped him of dignity in front of all. The man who had once been a shining exemplar of chivalry was now bearing the brunt of the capital's worst rumors, viewed with suspicion and even hatred by the very people who had once cheered him in tourneys. Although Margaery still managed a polite, poised smile each time she met Loras's eye, the anger in her heart raged at the injustice. He was her brother, the Knight of Flowers, golden and brave. He did not deserve to be torn down like this. In the far corner of the courtyard stood her grandmother, Lady Olenna, with a grip on her cane that bespoke her agitation. Mace Tyrell paced a few steps away, posture stiff, face drawn with worry. Their house was powerful and wealthy. So many bushels of wheat and barrels of wine and loads of gold coin poured in from the Reach. But all of that mattered little in King's Landing when the Lannisters still held the real seats of power. There was Tywin's lingering shadow, forever looming after his death. And there was Cersei's cunning, sharpened by desperation. Most of all, there was the labyrinth of alliances within the Red Keep. Subtleties could ruin a plan more swiftly than any blade. Yet Margaery knew something Cersei did not. She understood the shape of the people's hearts. Cersei thought fear was the only whip needed to keep the city in line. Margaery knew love was more enduring. Fear crackled hot and bright but could burn out, leaving resentment in its wake. Love, carefully nurtured, could last a generation, could be passed on from parent to child. Even in the short term, love could become a rallying cry that would see people stand against the tyranny of a single vicious queen. What if, Margaery asked herself, she didn't allow Cersei to tighten her hold? What if, before the Lioness of House Lannister could cement her control, the Rose of Highgarden used every petal at her disposal to rally the city in open rebellion? It was a dangerous dream. Treason, some might say. But what was treason, if not the name the old powers gave to the birth of something new? And Margaery Tyrell did not fancy herself a timid pawn on Cersei's board. If it meant saving her brother from the Faith's torturous meddling, if it meant protecting her grandmother from the next round of humiliations or possible assassinations, if it meant ensuring House Tyrell retained the influence it deserved, then Margaery would consider any risk worth taking. She took a deep breath and left the balcony. Step by deliberate step, she descended the winding staircase to the courtyard. She found her grandmother first, exchanging a fleeting look that told her they must speak soon in private. Olenna Tyrell's lips pressed in a thin line, her sharp, formidable gaze seeming to read Margaery's intentions at once. But Olenna said nothing, only inclined her head a fraction, as if in subtle approval. Mace Tyrell, on the other hand, had no such intuitive sense. He kept wringing his hands together and mumbling about alliances and possible treaties, as though a signed piece of parchment would ever hold back the tide of Cersei's ambition. Margaery walked to Loras as he finished his spar. He was panting, sweat darkening the once vibrant gold of his hair. He dismissed the young men with a few curt words of thanks. They rushed off, perhaps a bit intimidated by the tension hovering in the air. Margaery took Loras's hand, ignoring the slight trembling in his fingers. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically, from the constant threat of scandal and condemnation. But she would see him stand proud again. "You've improved, brother," she said, voice soft. "Your attacks are sharper, and your stance is steadier." His smile was taut. "Practice is all I can cling to. It's a small mercy that no one has forbidden me from it. The faith can tie me in knots at trial, but they haven't tried to break my sword arm yet. At least not directly." "They won't break it," she said, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "I won't allow it." He gave her a look, half hope and half resignation. "You have a plan?" Her gaze flicked toward the high windows of the Red Keep, as if she expected prying eyes and ears everywhere. "I do," she whispered, "but I'll need a great deal of help, and the stakes are high, perhaps higher than we've known before." She didn't elaborate. Loras was brave and dedicated, but he wasn't made for duplicity. He could keep secrets when necessary, but Margaery sensed it might be better not to share every detail of her intentions, for his own sake. He nodded anyway, trusting her. Despite the rumors of impropriety, of arrogance, and of deviant appetites whispered in dark corners, Loras was still the gallant knight who believed in his sister's capacity for compassion and cunning. That knowledge reassured Margaery more than she could say. After pressing his hand once more, Margaery turned to go. She caught her grandmother's eye again and tilted her chin in a silent invitation. Olenna gave a curt nod and began to follow her, leaning on her cane, stepping around Mace as if he were a piece of furniture. Mace followed in their wake, obviously intending to be part of this conversation. Margaery allowed it, though her father's involvement usually brought more hand-wringing than practicality. She had to tread lightly, as she wanted to keep House Tyrell intact, not sow suspicion within her own ranks. They slipped through a discreet door at the edge of the courtyard that led to a small corridor of the Red Keep rarely used by courtiers. The walls were damp and the sconces unlit, lending the place a conspiratorial hush. Only a single torch flickered near the far end, casting long shadows. Margaery led them to a recessed alcove where an old tapestry of some battlefield victory, likely from the Targaryen era, hung in tattered dignity. Before anyone else could speak, Olenna seized the initiative. "You're up to something, aren't you, girl?" Margaery pressed her lips together. "I have no choice, grandmother. The people of King's Landing have little love for Cersei. They resent her extravagances, her manipulations, her readiness to set the faith on whomever displeases her. They remember her allowing the faith militant to roam the streets, armed and dangerous, in exchange for her own advantage. The Great September might hold the power of the Seven, but the small folk do not blindly trust the High Sparrow. They only fear him because Cersei has placed his claws at their throats." Mace cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "There's no guarantee they'll rally to us. You know how fickle the crowd can be. They might turn on Tyrells as swiftly as on Lannisters." "Not if we give them more hope than the Lannisters have," Margaery insisted. "We are the breadbasket of Westeros. With our resources, the city will not starve. Food is a powerful incentive. A hungry belly listens to any rumor. But if that belly is fed by Tyrell gold, it might begin to favor a Tyrell queen." Mace wrung his hands. Yes, that's well and good, but you speak of open insurrection. If we topple Cersei, we risk throwing the realm into chaos. And the crown, what of Tommen? He is still the king, and you are his queen consort. If we move against his mother, how does that sit with the boy?" Margaery frowned. She had grown to care for Tommen in her own way, though her affections were laced with the pragmatic understanding that he was a king in name but still so very young. Tommen was gentle, kind, and easily swayed by those he trusted. Before, Margaery had tried to guide him toward good governance. Now, she wondered if it might be a kinder mercy to free him from his mother's poisonous influence. Once and for all, she didn't want to see him harmed, but neither would she let him become a weapon in Cersei's hands. "The realm is already in chaos," Olenna said sharply. "We're just not calling it so. Wars across the land, the Iron Bank demanding its coin, the faith more powerful than it's been in 100 years. The Targaryen girl rumored to be assembling armies across the narrow sea. And in the north, the Boltons are entrenched at Winterfell. Chaos is here, Mace. Our only question is whether we'll survive it. Her cane tapped the floor. If Margaery thinks she can bring the people around to our side and rid us of Cersei, I say let her try. The alternative is continuing to let that vicious lioness pick us off one by one. Margaery glanced at her father, who hesitated but said nothing. Turning her eyes to Olenna, she saw a flicker of fierce pride in her grandmother's stern face. For years, Margaery had studied how to win hearts, not just in the courts, but on the streets. She visited the poorest corners of King's Landing, giving alms, listening to the people's woes, showing them a gentle smile. She danced at the lavish feasts, yes, but she also stepped outside to find the beggars behind the kitchens, offering them bread and a kind word. All these acts had planted seeds that might bloom if properly tended. I plan to speak to the common folk, Margaery said quietly. Openly, I'll claim their loyalty not by threats, but by understanding. That is a danger, yes, because Cersei will not allow it freely. But I think if we move quickly, gather our house knights, and keep the gold flowing in strategic places, well, the city might turn on her in a single night if it's done carefully. Mace opened his mouth as if to protest, but Olenna's glare silenced him. The elder Tyrell nodded. My sweet girl, if you have the cunning for it, I will support you. We'll have to ensure the guards are on our side. You'll need to speak with certain captains, men we can bribe or manipulate. Baelish might have connections too, though I'd prefer not to rely on him. He's more snake than man. Still, let's not discount any possible route to success. Margaery felt her heart quickening. If she and Olenna were in alignment, then half the battle was won. As for Mace, he would fret, but eventually he would stand behind them. The trial for Loras was scheduled in a fortnight. Time was short, but in that short time, Margaery believed she could sow enough discontent that, should the faith convict Loras unfairly, the city's mood would tip into open anger and not fear. She started to outline her immediate steps. She would hold a series of public audiences near the Great September, disguised as acts of piety. She would speak to the bakers, the cloth merchants, the blacksmiths. She would let them know that the Tyrell coffers were ready to lighten their burdens. At each stop, she'd slip in a soft condemnation of the Queen Mother's excesses. It had to be subtle, accusations that sounded like lamentations, pleas for a gentler path. The seeds would grow. As Margaery spoke, Olenna's mouth curved into a tiny, approving smile. No one was as ruthless or as perceptive as the Queen of Thorns. She recognized the potential. If Margaery's plan worked, it would be a masterstroke. In a single surge, House Tyrell could unseat Cersei's hold over Tommen, over the faith, over the city's morale. Then came the problem of how to deal with Cersei Lannister herself. Execution? Exile? Imprisonment? That question hung in the air unspoken. But Margaery knew the cost of letting Cersei live freely. The woman would never rest until she had taken her vengeance. In a realm where mercy was often weakness, Margaery had to consider the unthinkable. Before she reached that point, though, she would gather her forces, stoke the city, and wait for the right moment. They parted soon after, each bearing their portion of the plan. Margaery felt strangely exhilarated, as though she had inhaled a lungful of crisp spring air. For so long, she had played the demure, gracious queen in waiting, the charitable lady. Now she was stepping onto a path of open defiance. No, that was too strong a word. A path of righteous correction, she might call it. Cersei had become a blight on King's Landing, like a queen gone mad with her own illusions of power. If no one moved against her now, it would only get worse. In the days that followed, Margaery moved with painstaking care. She visited the Great September in the morning, kneeling to pray before the statues of the Seven. The morning light poured through the stained glass windows, illuminating her in gentle hues. The faithful who had come to pray or to air their confessions saw the king's wife in humble supplication, her hands clasped. She wore no jewels on those days, only a plain gown of white and silver thread. Whenever she spoke with them, her tone was soft, understanding. She did not preach rebellion. She merely listened, eyes brimming with sympathy, as they lamented the taxes, the rising prices for bread, the bribes required by the new local officials empowered by the faith. She told them she wished the world could be kinder. She expressed sorrow that the crown's coin sometimes seemed to vanish into the lavish furnishings of the royal chambers, rather than going to the people's needs. "You must pray for Queen Cersei," she would say gently, "that the weight of her responsibilities does not crush her spirit, nor blind her to the plight of the commoners." A standard phrase, something that sounded innocuous. But in King's Landing, these words carried a distinct subtext. Pray that Cersei does not remain willfully blind, or that she finds the wisdom to stop these indignities. It planted the seed that the Queen Mother was, in fact, causing harm and that only Margaery was appealing to her better judgment. The worshippers, drawn to Margaery's warmth and empathy, would share these whispers with their friends and neighbors. Day by day, the current of dissatisfaction grew. She didn't stop there. Margaery reached out to the city's bakers, offering them Tyrell grain at a drastically reduced cost. "Bread must remain affordable," she told them. "For the love of the Seven." Her father, Mace, nearly choked at the sums involved, but she used her grandmother's authority to override him. The bakers, dozens of them throughout the city, were soon producing cheaper loaves. And who would they credit? Queen Margaery Tyrell. Each time a poor laborer bought bread for his family, paying less coin than he expected, the name of House Tyrell was on his lips. The mother who nursed her babe on borrowed time, the old man who lived on the street corner, each might see Margaery as the reason their children wouldn't starve. Love gained through generosity, not fear. It was precisely as she had hoped. Meanwhile, the gold cloaks received donations from certain Tyrell-aligned houses. Nothing overt, simply pouches of silver that could help them in their day-to-day tasks. A guard might find a new pair of boots left anonymously at his station, with a small rose motif stitched into the leather. Another might find that his wife's debts were mysteriously paid. This was Olenna's domain. She knew where to funnel coin to produce loyalty when the hour of need came. If the men who patrolled the city gates and the castle walls owed some hidden gratitude to House Tyrell, that gratitude might manifest itself at a critical moment. Cersei, for her part, sensed something was afoot. She was no fool. She noticed the diminishing hostility among the small folk toward Margaery. She heard rumors of cheaper bread and murmurs of the Queen's kindness. Once or twice, she almost confronted Margaery openly in the throne room, but Tommen was there. Ever since the fiasco with the Faith militants' empowerment, Tommen had been caught between his mother's stern guidance and Margaery's gentle persuasion. Confronting Margaery would only risk alienating Tommen further. So Cersei held her tongue, though her eyes burned with suspicion. She dispatched Qyburn's little birds, the whispers in the dark, to try and discover the truth. They brought back tidbits. The Tyrell girl was indeed meeting with commoners, distributing gifts, making gestures that seemed aimed at building public favor. But every action was couched in the language of piety or generosity. Nothing that pointed directly to treason. Cersei seethed, but she had no proof. Not yet. The High Sparrow was another matter. He knew that Margaery had a hold on the people that might eclipse his own. He had become a symbol of austere devotion, punishing moral failings wherever he perceived them, sometimes with harshness that made the small folk cower. Many still respected his vow of poverty, admired his unflinching condemnation of sin, but he found that more and more often, the people would speak of Margaery's kindness with a glimmer of warmth that they never showed him. Perhaps that was the difference between a blade that cuts away evil and a soft hand that soothes a wound. He confronted Margaery on one occasion, just outside the Great September. He spoke in his measured, pious tone. "My lady," he said, "the people speak well of you. They say you distribute food and coin in the poorest wards, that you visit the cripples and lepers on the street of Flower. They say you do this in the name of the Seven." She bowed her head. "I do, Your Holiness. Who else but the mother or the maiden would want us to care for the sick, the hungry, and the helpless?" He regarded her carefully. "Queen Cersei also claims devotion to the Seven. Yet you do not see fit to involve her in these charitable acts." Margaery lowered her gaze as if in sorrow. "I have invited her," But the Queen Mother has so many burdens. Her love for her children weighs on her, and her duties to the king preoccupy her. I do not wish to add to her worries." Such a mild, harmless answer, delivered with a small, regretful smile. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We must all bear each other's burdens. That is the true calling of faith." She curtsied and left him, ignoring the prickling sense of danger that crept up her spine. Though the High Sparrow lacked the cunning of an experienced courtier, his unyielding commitment to his brand of justice was formidable. He might decide that Margaery's philanthropic approach to the poor was, in fact, an attempt to set herself up as a figure revered above the faith. Even if that wasn't precisely correct, it was dangerously close in effect. If he turned on her, Margaery knew she would have to move fast. On the other hand, if enough of the city stood with her, then not even the faith could stop the wave of public fury. The High Sparrow might discover that zeal. OTS clubs and sermonizing had less power against a united populace than he believed. During these days, Margaery chose to remain close to Tommen whenever possible. She flattered him with small praises about his fairness as king, his gentle heart, his bright smile. He blushed under her attention, grateful for any show of affection. Despite Cersei's attempts to keep them apart, Margaery found time to stroll in the gardens with him, to chat about matters of state with a tenderness Cersei had never shown. She even coaxed him to speak of his mother's more controlling tendencies. He confessed how conflicted he felt, how he wished for peace but felt powerless to enact it, how he worried about Loras's trial but didn't want to contradict the faith. Margaery comforted him, delicately suggesting that if the people themselves demanded a fairer system, perhaps the faith would have to yield. Maybe, she hinted, King Tommen could show his love for justice by listening to his wife's counsel, by allowing the city to speak. Such talk filled his young head with visions of a kindly monarchy, beloved by all. Margaery never blamed him for Cersei's actions. She merely planted the idea that the king was independent, beholden to no single voice, not his mother's, not the faith's. In the end, his decisions would be his own. Tommen glowed at the thought, and though he remained timid, Margaery could tell his loyalty to her was deepening. If it came to a direct confrontation, he might not stand against her. That was enough for now. The night before Loras's trial, Margaery knelt by her bed in her private chambers, hands clasped in genuine prayer. A single candle lit the room. She wore a simple shift, her hair braided back. The reflection in the polished mirror across the room revealed her face, calm, resolute, touched by flickering light and shadow. She prayed for strength to do what had to be done. She prayed for her brother's safety, for the city's future, for House Tyrell. This was no empty ritual. She believed in the Seven, though not with the High Sparrow's rigid fervor. She believed enough to feel that her plan had moral weight, that she was not merely grasping for power but trying to end an injustice that had stretched on too long. By dawn, the city was stirring. News of Loras's trial had spread. Many believed the faith would convict him of sins that were rumored but never proven. Whispers flew, suggesting that men had come forth to testify about his private affairs, that he had violated the laws of gods and men. Others argued it was a political play by Cersei to weaken House Tyrell. Margaery herself was to attend, of course, though she still bore the label of a suspect in earlier inquiries by the faith. She would not allow fear to show on her face. Before she left her chambers, she received a brief missive from Olenna. The seeds are sown. If the trial turns ugly, the city will rise. That was all. Margaery's heart pounded, but she composed herself. Outside, her ladies-in-waiting helped her dress. She chose a gown of sea-green silk, embroidered with tiny roses at the cuffs. A golden belt clasped around her waist, and her hair was arranged in soft waves. She looked every inch the queen consort, but underneath the gown, her muscles were tense as drawn bowstrings. She made her way to the great September. Tommen waited there on the throne, flanked by members of the Kingsguard. Cersei stood behind him, wearing a gown of black and crimson, a defiant scowl etched into her features. The High Sparrow presided from the altar. A hush lay over the chamber, broken only by the rustle of robes and the faint shuffle of sandaled feet on marble. Loras stood before the High Sparrow, hands clasped. He looked far more subdued than the shining knight of old. His hair had been trimmed short, and he wore a threadbare tunic as a sign of supposed penitence. The faith wanted him to confess. If he did, he might be allowed to remain among the Seven's devout, but at a cost so dear Margaery trembled to imagine it. If he refused to confess, they would punish him more harshly. A no-win scenario, devised by men who believed in shame as a method of control. The trial began. The faith's witnesses were called, men who claimed to have known Loras intimately, to have seen him in acts condemned by the Seven. Each testimony dripped with lurid detail, though the High Sparrow couched it in pious language. In the crowd, some reacted with scandalized gasps, while others looked at Loras with pity or sorrow. Margaery's hands clasped in her lap, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to rise and shout that it was all a manipulative farce. Then, when asked to respond, Loras stood silent for a moment, glancing at his sister. She offered him a single, grave nod. If he spoke carefully, the city might tip. But she also feared that if he said the wrong words, the faith would crush him. In the end, he drew a trembling breath. "I have done many things," he said softly, "but I have hurt no one. If I have sinned in the eyes of the Seven, then I beg their mercy. But I will not confess to crimes that exist only in the minds of those who would destroy my house." A murmur swept through the September. The High Sparrow pressed him, calling him proud and unrepentant. Loras insisted that the allegations had been twisted into monstrous shapes for the sake of politics. He cast a look at Cersei, and one of the faith's sparrows barked at him not to drag the Queen Mother's name into his defense. Tommen shifted in his seat, caught between the faith's gravity and the sight of his wife's brother standing accused. In that charged silence, Margaery stood. She had not been called to speak, but she stepped forward, raising her voice for all to hear. "My brother is a knight of the realm," she said clearly. "He has served King Renly, King Joffrey, and now King Tommen with honor. He has fought bravely in tourneys. He has shed blood on the battlefield for the crown. He has brought no harm to the small folk, nor has he ever worked injustice upon an innocent. I ask the Seven to guide us to a merciful verdict. I ask the High Sparrow to consider Loras's record of loyalty and chivalry. Is that so easily discarded?" The High Sparrow's gaze pinned her. "We do not discard loyalty, my lady, but neither can we ignore sin. If a man has committed grievous offenses against the laws of gods and men, he must answer for them, no matter his past glories." She bowed her head. "I do not deny the authority of the faith, but I fear we are letting prejudice overshadow reason. Let the people speak in his defense if you doubt me." At that moment, at the back of the sept, a voice called out, "Ser Loras has done no harm." Another joined, "He saved my brother from brigands once." Then another, "He's the Knight of Flowers, a champion for the meek." A ripple of voices grew, some scattered among the crowd. Margaery's heart soared. Her allies were here, not knights or high lords, but commoners who had come at her urging, or who had been helped by Tyrell coin, or who had quietly admired the Tyrells over the years. Their shouts echoed in the vaulted space, building tension. The faith militant stirred, scowling, but more and more people raised their voices, calling for the trial to end, for the faith to grant mercy. Others began to chant Margaery's name, praising her as a queen who cared. The High Sparrow tried to quell the uproar, but it swelled, fed by the frustration of a city that was tired of seeing its heroes humiliated. Cersei stiffened. Her eyes flashed with rage at the sudden tide in the September. She had never considered that the people might so openly side against the faith, let alone her. But Margaery had orchestrated this carefully. Throughout the city, dozens, then hundreds, of small folk had been told that if the faith mistreated Loras or if Cersei continued to impose cruelty, they should shout their discontent. Gather at the Great September, show that they would not be cowed. Margaery's father had stationed a few loyal Tyrell guards outside, prepared to keep order but also to fan the spark of protest if needed. It was a precarious plan. Riot might erupt, But Margaery had reached a point where subtlety had to be replaced by open demonstration. The High Sparrow banged his staff against the floor, calling for order. Tommen, caught in confusion, looked to his mother. Cersei tried to approach him, but the press of the outraged crowd was growing, even within the September. Some of the Faith's armed men stepped forward, blocking the throng that had begun to surge down the aisle. Margaery's heart pounded, but she showed no sign of fear. She stepped beside her brother, taking his hand. She raised her voice again. "The city demands justice, Your Holiness," she said. "Please, do not let zeal turn to persecution. This is blasphemy." The High Sparrow intoned, but his voice wavered. The crowd roared in protest. One older woman wept openly, begging the Faith not to take Ser Loras away. A group of younger men, some of them sporting rose badges, shouted that the Tyrells had fed the city. Where was the gratitude? The gold cloaks near the entrance held their spears uncertainly. They had been told by their commander to maintain order, but they recognized that a large portion of the crowd was leaning on the Tyrell side. Some had been bribed or swayed by House Tyrell, as Olenna had planned. Cersei, reading the writing on the wall, hissed to Tommen, "Declare the trial over. Command them to arrest Loras now." Tommen looked aghast. "But the people." "Do it," she insisted, her voice urgent. "If we do not act, we lose all control." But Tommen was young and rattled. He watched as the Faith militant tried to contain the protests, saw them brandishing their cudgels at the crowd, threatening. One man was struck down. Another shouted in fury. The tension rippled outward, an unstoppable wave. Tommen stood abruptly, voice cracking as he attempted to speak. "Enough! You must maintain peace. If the Faith sees fit to convict Ser Loras, let him be treated with dignity until..." It was too late. The Sept erupted in shouts. A group of small folk pushed past the Faith's line, forming a protective cordon around Loras and Margaery. The High Sparrow called them heretics. Some of the Faith militant advanced, weapons raised. Swords rattled from scabbards as the king's guardsmen tried to separate them. An armed confrontation inside the Great September loomed. Margaery, her heart in her throat, signaled quietly to her father's men. One by one, they moved into strategic positions, standing shoulder to shoulder with the city folk. Outside, the bells began to ring, signals that trouble was afoot. Margaery's gamble had been that if the Faith tried to punish Loras in front of the city, it would spark moral outrage. She was right, but the intensity of the moment still terrified her. She kept her face calm, determined not to let panic set in. At the altar, the High Sparrow raised his hands, calling for silence. "Your souls are in peril," he began, voice booming with fervor. "The Mother of Sin stands before you, encouraging you to defy the judgment of the Seven. Will you forsake the light of the Mother for the darkness of worldly temptation?" Cersei seized Tommen's arm. "They're turning on us," she whispered, panic in her eyes. Qyburn, standing behind them, glanced around calculatingly. The murmuring in the crowd was not just about Loras's innocence now. There were open calls for Cersei to be stripped of her power. Someone shouted that it was she who had armed the Faith militant, unleashing them on the city. Another demanded that the mother of the king stand trial herself for the countless sins rumored around court. The place seethed with condemnation. A single chant rose from near the main doors. "Long live Queen Margaery! Long live Queen Margaery!" A few voices joined, then more. The Faith militant tried to stamp it out with threats, but it was like trying to silence a storm. Once unleashed, the crowd's pent-up frustration roared to life. Margaery hadn't expected quite this swift a pivot to open rebellion, but she would adapt. She stood straighter, lifted her chin. "I plead to the king's mercy," she said clearly, though her gaze swept past Tommen to the crowd. "Let there be no violence. Let Ser Loras be placed under the king's protection until a fair trial can be arranged, one that does not rely solely on rumor." Tommen blinked. Yes, that is fair," he stammered. Then he looked to the High Sparrow. "Your Holiness, I command you to step back. to return Ser Loras to the custody of the Red Keep, under my personal guard until further notice. Cersei's eyes widened in horror. She hissed at her son, "You can't do that." But Tommen was too frightened, too desperate for a solution. He shook free of her grip. The High Sparrow drew himself up. "You overstep, my king. The faith is the final arbiter of sins against the seven. If you shield a sinner from holy justice." The crowd began to surge again, shouting, "Let the king have his say. Obey the king. Down with the faith militant." Slogans that just days ago would have been unthinkable. Sensing the tide of anger, the gold cloaks stepped between the people and the faith's men. The tension crackled. "Obey the king," the lead gold cloak growled, raising his sword to the faith militant. The people cheered. Clearly, Tyrell coin had done its work. Cersei realized in that moment that if the High Sparrow defied Tommen, he would be defying the crown. And the crowd, whipped into fury, might tear the sept apart. She whispered to the High Sparrow from a distance, "Stand down or you'll lose everything." He stared at her, eyes blazing. Then, with a tight frown, he gestured to the faith's soldiers to lower their weapons. They did so, grudgingly, but their grim stares promised retribution in time. Margaery breathed a silent sigh of relief. Loras's life was spared, for the moment. She didn't dare celebrate yet. "Take Ser Loras to the Red Keep," Tommen ordered, voice shaking but resolute. "He will remain there under guard, to await a fair re-examination of these charges." The crowd erupted in cheers. Margaery clung to Loras, tears of relief shining in her eyes. He sagged against her, trembling. They had not won entirely, but they had evaded the faith's clutches. This partial victory, publicly wrested from the High Sparrow's authority, was a huge blow to the faith's power. And the small folk had openly defied the Queen Mother's wishes. Even if Cersei tried to paint it differently, the people would remember this day. As guards escorted Loras and Margaery out of the September, the crowd parted. Some knelt, murmuring her name, praising her mercy. She offered them serene smiles, quiet nods, letting them believe she was their champion. The city was ablaze with rumor and excitement. Word would spread like wildfire of how Queen Margaery stood up against the faith and against Cersei's cruelty. Cersei, for her part, walked stiffly beside Tommen, face pale and twisted with rage. She might lash out soon, Margaery thought. She would not take this humiliation calmly. But as Margaery emerged from the Great September, the chorus of cheers reminded her that she was no longer fighting in the shadows. The people had chosen a side, or enough of them had. That was the moment Margaery resolved to press her advantage. If she hesitated, if she allowed time for Cersei to regroup, the old powers might reassert themselves. She needed to move swiftly to solidify the city's newfound solidarity behind her cause. That night, Margaery convened with Olenna, Mace, and several Tyrell bannermen in a hidden chamber within the Red Keep. It was one of the many passages rumored to have been built by Maegor the Cruel, though now used to keep prying ears away. The mood in the room was electric. Loras, too exhausted to attend, was safe in a guarded bedchamber, receiving medical care. Olenna looked more alive than she had in years, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "You did it," she said, the beginnings of a smile playing on her lips. "You turned their precious trial into a rally. The faith has lost face, and the small folks' affections are shifting to you." One of the bannermen, a broad-shouldered knight named Ser Garland Oakhart, grinned. "I saw the way they chanted your name, my lady. If you wanted to seize the city outright, now might be the time." Margaery drew a trembling breath. "It's a matter of how. I do not wish for open bloodshed in the streets. That would ruin any goodwill we've built. But I see no alternative to removing Cersei from a position of power. She remains the poison at the heart of the Red Keep. As long as she is near Tommen, she can manipulate or threaten him." Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. "We must ensure that the king remains on our side. If we move violently against his mother, it might turn him against us. And then all of this is for naught." Margaery nodded, acknowledging the risk. She had carefully cultivated Tommen's trust. but he was still a child. If he witnessed his mother's downfall, would he grow to resent Margaery? She was torn between the realm's need for justice and the boy's own feelings. Once again, she found herself thinking that perhaps the Kinder route was a swift resolution, an exile or even imprisonment that kept Cersei far from Tommen's ear, that might be less cruel than letting her remain close, gnawing at the edges of his mind, sowing chaos. "Grandmother," Margaery asked, "what do you advise? Should we arrest Cersei for high treason? The charges would be easy enough to fabricate, and not entirely false." Olenna's smile was acid. "Treason, murder, conspiring with the faith to usurp royal powers. Pick any or all, my sweet girl. She'll be damned if we speak the truth. But we must handle this delicately. She has her spies, her loyal knights, and of course, Qyburn and his horrifying experiments. Attempting to seize her openly might provoke conflict in the Red Keep." Ser Garland leaned forward. "What if we rally the people again? Let them demand that the king remove his mother from power. It would create a wave of public opinion that Tommen cannot ignore." Margaery considered that. Yes, it might, but Tommen would be caught off guard. He might resist for his mother's sake. "I'd prefer a quieter approach." Mace coughed. "Perhaps she could be invited to a private meeting, somewhere within the keep, where we quietly detain her. Tommen will do as we say if we claim she's a traitor. He's too young to defy us on his own. But the key is to control the narrative, so the city understands that we're acting for the good of the realm." Margaery nodded slowly, acknowledging that while it sounded underhanded, it might spare them from a bloody confrontation. "We'll need to plan every detail. We must ensure that the king remains safe and physically away from Cersei at the crucial moment. And we must coordinate with the gold cloaks we've bought or influenced, so that Cersei's loyalists can't break her out." Olenna's knuckles whitened on the top of her cane. "We have little time. Cersei will counterattack, and soon. She must be furious that her attempt to humiliate Loras and me was thwarted. But if we move swiftly, we can outmaneuver her." A hush fell. All in attendance recognized they were tipping into a full coup, displacing the Queen Mother, effectively severing the Lannister hold on Tommen's decisions. But Margaery felt a powerful sense of conviction. Better a short, decisive action now than endless scheming that left the city in tatters. She thought of the anxious families who prayed she would shield them from the faith's harshness, the many who thanked her for the cheaper bread. She owed them a stable city, not a drawn-out conflict that SPI led innocent blood. This was the path. That very night, Margaery penned a brief note to Cersei, requesting her presence in the Royal Solar the next afternoon to discuss a matter of utmost importance to our king's well-being. She sealed it with Tommen's personal sigil and arranged for one of Tommen's most trusted pages to deliver it, so Cersei would assume it came directly from her son. Meanwhile, she arranged for Tommen to be spirited away on a tour of the city, an event that would appear quite public but in fact be carefully orchestrated by Tyrell guards. Ser Garland Oakhart, with a contingent of men loyal to House Tyrell, would escort Tommen through the wards that had received the most Tyrell aid, ensuring a warm reception. By the time Cersei realized she couldn't use Tommen as a shield, it would be too late. Margaery herself spent the morning mingling with courtiers, presenting a front of calm normalcy. She attended a small council meeting where she, Mace, and a few Lannister sycophants discussed trade issues. She made polite conversation, offered mild suggestions, and left them with no reason to suspect an imminent move. All the while, tension coiled in her stomach. She knew word might leak that Cersei might guess something. But the city was large, the day busy, and the Lannister network of spies had been thrown off balance by the fiasco at the September. If Margaery's luck held, none of them would detect the final stroke until it was delivered. At midday, Margaery headed to the Royal Solar. It was a spacious chamber with high windows overlooking the bay. Sunlight filtered through, warm and welcoming, as if to bless what was about to happen. Olenna waited inside, leaning on her cane. 2 Tyrell guards stood discreetly by the door. Margaery had insisted they keep a minimal presence. This had to look like a standard meeting, at least until Cersei was within their grasp. Soon enough, the door opened, and Cersei swept in, her posture tight with suppressed anger. She wore a gown of deep black, embroidered with gold lions. Behind her stood 2 Queensguard knights, each with a white cloak draped over silver armor. They eyed the Tyrell guards warily. "Where is my son?" Cersei demanded immediately. Margaery gave a gracious half-bow. "He's seeing to his duties, your grace. I asked you here to speak about his situation. Please have a seat." Cersei did not budge. Olenna's mouth twitched in a small smirk. The tension was thick enough to strangle. Margaery clasped her hands in front of her, projecting calm. "I believe Tommen is no longer safe under your guidance," she said quietly, letting each word fall like a heavy stone. "We must secure his rule, and that means removing dangerous influences. We both know the Faith militant has grown too powerful, thanks to the arrangement you made." Cersei's jaw clenched. "You dare accuse me of endangering my son? You armed the Faith." Olenna cut in, voice crisp. "You turned them loose on the city. You dragged my grandson into a farce of a trial. You tried to use the Faith to rid the court of your enemies. And now the people are furious. They look to my granddaughter for leadership, real leadership. The king's mother is no longer welcome." Cersei's eyes darted to the guards, to Margaery's cold, unwavering stare. "This is treason," she hissed. Margaery lifted her chin. "It is justice. The city stands with me. If you force a conflict, you will lose. We have the gold, the bread, and the loyalty of the people." One of the Queensguard knights moved slightly, hand on hilt, but Olenna raised her cane in a gesture, and Margaery's guards tensed. For a moment it seemed swords might be drawn right then, but Cersei raised her hand. "Stop. You are not harming me in this chamber. Not while my son is king." Olenna gave a derisive snort. "You assume your son would protect you. I'm afraid the king is currently inspecting the wards of King's Landing, under our vigilant guard. He will not be returning until this matter is settled." Cersei's eyes flashed. "You cunning old viper." Margaery took a single step forward. "I do not want bloodshed. You may accept exile. We will arrange a ship with provisions and you will depart Westeros. If you defy us, we will arrest you for conspiracy against the crown, for encouraging the Faith to hold trial over innocent knights, for a litany of crimes stretching back to your first day in King's Landing. And believe me, Queen Mother, I have evidence enough to damn you 10 times over." Cersei's lips curled in a snarl. For a heartbeat, Margaery wondered if she might hurl herself forward, if she might attempt something desperate. The Queensguard knights, though loyal to Cersei, hesitated. Tyrell guards stood ready, and they were outnumbered. Cersei was cunning enough to see she couldn't fight her way out of this chamber. "You think you've won," she spat, voice low. "But the Lannisters do not go so quietly." Olenna's retort was swift. "I've dealt with your father, your brother, your entire brood. I have never feared a Lannister, and I do not intend to start today." Margaery held up a calming hand, though her heart pounded. "You can choose to leave peacefully. We will provide a comfortable exile in the free cities. Alternatively, you face a trial for your crimes. The outcome of that trial is all but certain, and you know it." For a long moment, Cersei said nothing. Her face was a mask of fury. The tension in the room crackled. Then she let out a bitter laugh. "You cunning rose. You act so sweet, but inside you're as ruthless as any lion. Very well. Allow me to speak to my son before I accept any arrangement." Margaery shook her head gently. "You know I can't permit that. Your presence would only manipulate him further. No, you must decide now. Go into exile, or we proceed with your arrest." Cersei's knuckles were white at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. Her eyes flicked around the room. 2 Tyrell guards, Olenna's unwavering glare, Margaery's calm finality. The broad-chested Queensguard knights who could do nothing to save her if it came to open combat. She let out a ragged breath. "If I leave, you will slander my name forever. You will poison Tommen's mind against me." Margaery didn't flinch. "I won't lie to him about you, but I won't whitewash your actions either. He will grow to make his own judgment of your deeds." Cersei's gaze cut to the side. She trembled with rage, but her voice, when it came, was cold as steel. "Very well, little Rose. I'll go. But if you think this is over, you are gravely mistaken. My family has roots that go deeper than you can imagine. One day, you'll choke on your own lies, and the Lannisters will have the last roar." Olenna rolled her eyes. "Spare us the theatrics. You may keep your illusions." Cersei turned to her Queensguard, inclining her head. "Stand down. We're leaving." They looked at her in shock, but a single glare silenced their protests. Cersei turned back to Margaery. "I'll want safe passage out of the city. I want a ship properly provisioned, and no harm done to my retinue." "Granted," Margaery agreed, though she planned to keep the retinue small. "But I insist that you depart tomorrow at dawn. You'll be escorted to the docks." Cersei nodded stiffly. Her face was pale, her lips pressed so thin they were nearly bloodless. She swept out, the Queensguard following with uncertain steps. Margaery felt an almost dizzying sense of relief as the door closed behind her. They had done it. She had forced Cersei from the center of power without a single sword stroke. It was not a final victory. The Lannisters in the west might still react, might cause trouble. But for now, King's Landing was under Tyrell influence. Tommen would be free of his mother's manipulations. The city had a queen consort who was loved by the people. Olenna exhaled, leaning on her cane. "Well done. You've saved us a bloody confrontation." Then, with a touch of weariness, she added, "But keep your eyes open. She may still try something before she leaves." Margaery nodded. "I'll have our men guard her movements closely until she's on that ship. Then we can announce that she has chosen a retreat to the Free Cities for her health, or some other polite fabrication." Olenna's mouth curved in satisfaction. "The realm will gossip, but let them. They already gossip. Now you can get on with ruling." She paused, then her voice softened a fraction. "This was a risk, granddaughter, but you carried it through with grace. Your future as queen might be bright indeed." That night, the city was still buzzing with rumors. Some said the Queen Mother had been forced out by the Tyrells. Others said she'd chosen to flee rather than face charges. Still others believed she was planning some cunning counterstrike. But as dawn broke, an honor guard escorted Cersei and a handful of her loyal staff through the city to the docks. A few onlookers hurled insults at her, remembering how the faith militant had terrorized them. Cersei walked tall, ignoring the shouts, though bitterness twisted her features. Tommen was nowhere to be seen, and that fact alone outraged her most. She boarded the waiting ship with a single backward glance at the city that had once feared her, and now cast her out. Margaery heard from her watchers that Cersei made no move to defy them, likely concluding it was hopeless. For now, the last glimpse anyone had of her that morning was the sharp silhouette of her black gown on the deck, staring at the receding shoreline as the ship pulled away. After Cersei's departure, the people slowly realized that King's Landing had changed. Margaery visited neighborhoods, accompanied by Loras, still recovering but free, and by Tommen, who was shy at first, but warmed as the crowds cheered. They called out blessings upon the king and the queen, praising them for ridding the city of the faith's tyranny, for bringing relief. Though the High Sparrow still lingered in the Great September, his influence was severely undermined. He had lost the direct backing of the throne. The small folk, heartened by Margaery's generosity, no longer trembled at his threats. Bit by bit, the faith's stranglehold on the city loosened. Margaery oversaw new measures: distribution of grain to the poorest wards, reopening of certain trade routes stifled by Cersei's policies, and an amnesty for minor offenses that had filled the city dungeons under the faith's watch. She arranged for the gold cloaks to keep order, but she also instructed them not to harass the small folk unnecessarily. The shift in atmosphere was palpable. The stench of fear began to lift from the streets. People might still be poor, but at least they saw hope. Margaery offered them that hope in the form of a fairer realm, perhaps not perfectly just, but better than what Cersei had offered. Tommen grew more comfortable in his role as a figurehead king, guided by Margaery. He relied on her counsel for nearly everything. Sometimes that worried her. He was still so young, and she did not want him to remain forever naive. But for the moment, it allowed her to steer the realm toward stability. Loras was named Master of Laws, a gesture that both redeemed him and ensured that the reforms Margaery wanted would move forward. Olenna remained a formidable advisor, cutting down any Lannister sympathizers who tried to sabotage Margaery's efforts. The rest of the small council was either swayed by Tyrell gold or recognized that the tide had turned. Even the High Sparrow, forced to accept the new reality, approached Margaery privately. He was guarded, but he apologized for the violence that erupted at Loras's trial, claiming he had only wanted to see justice done. Margaery carefully avoided humiliating him, but made it clear that his authority would be restricted to spiritual matters. If he tried to overstep again, he would find the entire city unwilling to comply. She also pointed out that if he truly cared for the people's welfare, he would embrace her philanthropic reforms rather than attempt to rule through fear. Cornered, he gave a small nod and backed away. He likely hoped for a day when he could reassert the faith's power, but for now, he had no choice but to bow to Margaery's popularity. In the weeks that followed, the city breathed easier. Margaery's hold was not unassailable. Beyond the walls, the Tyrell-Lion alliance was uncertain. Some Lannister loyalists in the west might resent Cersei's exile and bide their time for a counterattack. Yet King's Landing itself glowed with new life. Markets bustled, trade resumed, and while the threat of war still lurked in the broader realm, at least the capital found a semblance of calm. As harvest wagons arrived from the Reach, prices for bread and produce fell further. The people marveled at having a queen who truly cared. Margaery, for her part, found herself living up to her carefully cultivated image, not just as a facade, but because she realized the people's admiration humbled her, inspired her to be the monarch they believed her to be. Within the Red Keep, a new atmosphere took root. Gone were many of the old Lannister courtiers who sneered at House Tyrell. Gone were the faith militant agents who once prowled the halls. A gentler hush lay over the corridors, broken only by the footfalls of gold-cloaked guards loyal to the crown and by the bustling of servants who no longer cowered. Margaery introduced small changes: fresh flowers in the throne room, gardens restored to full splendor, open audiences where petitioners could be heard without excessive bribes or threats. Tommen, though still a boy, seemed to thrive under this environment, his sweet nature blossoming. Loras regained some of his old cheer, though the trial had left him with scars of humiliation. The city recognized him once more as the Knight of Flowers, a symbol of chivalry and bravery. Many whispered that this was the reign King's Landing had long awaited, a gentle king, guided by a wise and compassionate queen, free of the shadow cast by Cersei's ruthless ambition. Others worried that the lack of ruthlessness might one day be the city's undoing if faced with foreign invaders or rebellious lords. Margaery understood that a crown was never truly secure, but she believed if she built her reign on genuine loyalty, rather than fear, House Tyrell might hold the capital strong enough to withstand challenges. From across the sea, rumors trickled in of Daenerys Targaryen's rising power, of dragons and freed slaves. In the north, the Boltons tightened their grip on Winterfell. Conflicts flared in the Riverlands. But for now, at the heart of the realm, Margaery Tyrell had shaped a new order in King's Landing, one that had deposed Cersei Lannister before her cruelty could harden into absolute tyranny. A morning came when Margaery wandered the streets outside the Red Keep in disguise, a hooded cloak of simple brown cloth, with only 2 trusted guards following at a distance. She wanted to see with her own eyes how the city fared. She passed bakers who offered fresh loaves at fair prices. She saw children playing in alleyways without the terror of faith militant patrols. She even saw a group of women gossiping, their words drifting in the breeze. Queen Margaery's got a heart of gold, they say. She paid the dowry for poor Bessie's daughter to wed that stable boy. Saved them from ruin. She did. May the mother bless her. Margaery felt a warm flush of satisfaction. She had orchestrated Bessie's dowry only days before, but she had done so quietly, not wanting it to seem like a grand gesture. Hearing the gratitude from these women reminded her why she had taken such risks. For all the savage cruelty that had plagued King's Landing, these small moments of kindness carried immeasurable weight in the hearts of the people. As she rounded a corner, she came upon a small shrine to the Seven. A few candles burned there in dim holders. An old man knelt, murmuring a prayer. He glanced over at Margaery, offered a kind smile. "Here to light a candle for loved ones. Friend?" She paused. "Yes," she said softly, drawing a coin from her pocket and placing it in a wooden bowl. She lit a small taper and set it in the holder. The dancing flame reminded her of how fragile victory could be in this land of intrigues and shifting alliances. She bowed her head, praying silently for peace, for resilience, and for the wisdom to guide Tommen in the turbulent times ahead. Then she turned and departed, the hush of the shrine lingering in her ears. In the Red Keep, she found Tommen awaiting her return. He rushed up excitedly as soon as she entered the grand hallway, his cheeks pink. "Margaery, you must see the improvements to the courtyard. Loras has planted new rose bushes. They're so beautiful." She laughed softly. "Yes, my sweet king, I will come at once." She let him lead her, her heart brimming with affection for the boy. Once, their marriage had been a chess move in the Game of Thrones. Yet, as she watched him chat eagerly, describing the colors of the roses, she felt an almost sisterly fondness for him. She vowed to protect him from the darkness that lurked in the world. Let the Lannisters call her traitor, let them scheme from afar. She would not abandon the path of careful generosity she had forged. That evening, she and Loras dined together in a small parlor, away from the official feasts. Olenna was absent, having taken to bed early with a headache. Margaery's ladies-in-waiting attended discreetly, but she dismissed them after the final course, leaving her alone with her brother. They spoke of old memories, of Highgarden's gentle hills, of their father's bumbling attempts at strategy, of Renly's short-lived glory, of the ache of losing him and so many others. Loras sipped wine, his eyes distant. "Did you ever think," he said, swirling the red liquid in his goblet, "that we would come to rule King's Landing this way? Not through direct conquest or a marriage alliance alone, but through the people's favor." Margaery smiled. "I always hoped the people's hearts mattered. That's all. If we'd had to rely on cunning alone, we'd always be playing the Lannisters' game. But showing genuine kindness, sometimes it changes everything." He studied her. "You are kinder than you realize, Margaery, but you're also more cunning than most. You've found a balance. I'm proud of you." She felt her eyes grow moist. Loras's approval meant a great deal. After everything he had endured, he still believed in her. She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "We'll keep moving forward, one day at a time. We have won a respite, if not the entire realm. But at least we've made King's Landing a place where people can breathe." "Yes," he said. "And now that Cersei is gone, the city can heal. Perhaps this is truly the start of a better era." She nodded, though part of her braced for future storms. The realm was vast, with conflicts that might spill into the capital eventually. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of contentment. They had averted tragedy, saved Loras from the Faith's cruelty, removed Cersei's iron grip. If the day came when foreign invaders appeared on the horizon with dragons, or if the dead rose in the north, then she would face those threats as well. But she would do so with her family, her city, and the people's trust. Late that night, long after Loras had gone to his chambers, Margaery took a solitary walk along the ramparts. The moon was high, silvering the rooftops of the sleeping city. She looked down at the winding streets, the flicker of torches by the harbor. She thought of Cersei, out on some ship in the narrow sea, cursing Margaery's name, plotting vengeance. She thought of how, in another life, they might have found common ground. Two women determined to protect their families at all costs, but their paths had always diverged. Now, at least, the city would not burn under the threat of wildfire or starve under the burden of tyranny. A gentle queen held the reins, and the people, by and large, approved. "Let tomorrow bring what it may," Margaery whispered to the night sky. "I will face it." She turned and walked back into the Red Keep, a quiet smile on her lips. If there was one thing Margaery Tyrell knew, it was how to make people love her, and that love was the greatest armor she could wear in a city of daggers and whispers. In the end, She believed love might prove stronger than fear. And so, with Cersei deposed before she could consolidate her reign of terror, Margaery moved forward into an uncharted future, one illuminated by the soft glow of hope, a hope she had fought for with every ounce of her cunning and compassion. Margaery Tyrell awoke the next morning to the low murmur of distant voices echoing through the Red Keep's corridors. For a moment, she lay still, remembering how different the castle had felt when Cersei Lannister's presence loomed behind every throne room pillar and antechamber door. It was only a handful of days since Cersei's forced exile, yet King's Landing was already shedding layers of its old dread. The city was not free from danger, far from it, but fear no longer wrapped itself around the populace like a chokevine. Margaery breathed in, her heart lighter than it had been in many moons. She rose and dressed in a simple morning gown of pale yellow, her hair twisted into a modest braid coiled at her nape. There would be time enough for more elaborate styles later, when she had to step into her public role. Just now, she craved the lightness of cloth that wouldn't drag on marble floors, and a hairstyle that wouldn't take an hour's tending. As her maid finished pinning the last curl in place, Margaery stepped onto the balcony. The dawn sky stretched over Blackwater Bay, where small fishing boats bobbed upon pink-tinted swells. Fewer Lannister sails crowded the royal harbor these days. Cersei's retinue had sailed with her, and some of the king's so-called allies among lesser western lords had departed in the middle of the night, presumably to scurry back to Casterly Rock with tales of betrayal. Margaery suspected they would try to paint her coup as the rise of House Tyrell at King Tommen's expense. But if Tommen remained loyal to her and House Tyrell, those lords could posture all they wished. The city's new queen consort would be far beyond their reach. She turned away from the dawn and made for the corridor. Outside her chambers, a pair of gold cloaks snapped to attention. These were among the men Olenna Tyrell and her father Mace had quietly encouraged with gold and gifts in weeks past. Their loyalty belonged far less to the Lannisters than it once had. Margaery nodded in greeting and set off toward Tommen's apartments. Halfway there, she encountered her brother Loras. He wore a tunic bearing the golden rose of Tyrell against a field of green, and despite the lingering lines of fatigue on his handsome face, he looked better than he had in months. Gone was the pallor of constant dread that had haunted him when the Faith threatened him with torture. He bowed his head slightly in greeting. "Good morning, sister." "Good morning, Ser Loras. You're up early." He gave a soft smile. "I've grown tired of lying about in bed. Besides, there's much work to be done. The city's still in a cautious state. They accept our new arrangement, but the small folk want reassurance that we're not simply a gentler version of tyranny." Margaery's expression grew sober. "Of course, we need to prove we truly stand for them, but I'd like to think they see the difference already." Then her gaze flickered down the hallway, to the door behind which the king's bedchamber lay. "I'm on my way to Tommen. Join me?" Loras nodded. They continued together, the polished marble floors reflecting patterns of sunshine from narrow windows. As they neared the king's apartments, Margaery noticed a lone figure standing guard outside the ornate doors. It was Ser Boros Blunt, once infamous for his cowardly manner, but still sworn to the Kingsguard. He dipped his head, stepped aside to allow them entry. Margaery studied his face and saw no particular animosity, mostly resignation. The Kingsguard had always been more loyal to whoever wore the crown than to anyone Lannister or Tyrell. Inside, a pair of serving boys rushed about, preparing breakfast. Tommen sat at a large table near the windows, nibbling on a honey-soaked pastry while flipping through a children's book of fables. He was still very much a child at heart. Yet, the weight of the crown had matured him in subtle ways over these recent tumultuous months. His eyes lit up when he spotted Margaery and Loras. "Good morning," Tommen said, hastily setting the book aside. I was just reading." He looked a tad self-conscious, as if worried Loras might tease him for such a simple pastime. Loras smiled kindly. "And which tale has caught your fancy this morning, Your Grace?" Tommen's cheeks pinked a little. "It's the one about the lion and the mouse. It says even the smallest creature can help a great beast when the time comes." His voice dropped, as if these words carried unexpected significance. I like that moral, that everyone has value. Margaery's heart warmed. This, she thought, was why she wanted so dearly to protect him. He wasn't like Joffrey. He had a sweetness to him that made him sensitive to the struggles of the small folk. That's a wise lesson, my king, she said, sitting on a nearby chair. Loras remained standing at her side, arms crossed loosely. I'm sure it will serve you well. Tommen brightened. I'd like to see more of them, of the people, They were so happy when we toured the wards the other day. It felt good to share a smile with them. He glanced at Loras. But I know there are tensions, too. Some are worried about the faith. Some are worried about taxes and the war in the Riverlands. And they ask about my mother. He said the last part with a slight wobble in his voice, and Margaery exchanged a quick look with Loras. They had all known this moment would come. Tommen had not yet fully confronted the reality that Cersei was gone from the city, exiled by royal decree. Margaery had no illusions that Tommen believed it was truly his own command, but they had carefully framed it so that, in the eyes of the populace, the king was the one who insisted on his mother's departure. The official announcement claimed that Queen Mother Cersei had chosen to seek peace overseas after the fiasco with the faith militant. Margaery reached for Tommen's hand. The city does have questions, but they also know you are safe and well, and they see a better future under your leadership. She let that reassurance settle. It's natural for them to wonder if your mother might return someday. Do you wish to speak about it? Tommen's gaze dropped to the pastry crumbs on his plate. He considered for a moment, brow furrowing. I know she did things, he said softly. Sometimes I think she hurt more people than she helped. But she is still my mother. I remember how she'd tuck me into bed and sing to me, once. He shook his head, trying to banish the conflict from his young mind. I just hope she's all right wherever she is. Margaery felt a pang of sympathy for him, though she also remembered all too well how Cersei had manipulated every advantage, nearly destroying Margaery's life and those of her loved ones. Carefully, she said, I believe your mother will survive. She is strong even if her decisions were not always just. For now, the realm is safer with her gone. Tommen swallowed and nodded. Yes, you're right. Then he flicked his gaze toward Loras. There's another matter. Some of my counselors have whispered that Uncle Kevin might come to King's Landing. He's in the Westerlands, near Casterly Rock, trying to sort out the tensions among my mother's allies. They say he might not be pleased with the new arrangement here. Loras gave Margaery an almost imperceptible nod, ceding the explanation to her. Lord Kevin is likely to travel here eventually, Margaery said gently. He was your grandfather Tywin's brother, and he served the crown as regent for a time in official histories, though that was overshadowed when your mother took the reins after Lord Tywin's death. Now that the city is more or less in our hands, Kevin may wish to reassert a Lannister presence. But we can welcome him diplomatically, if that is your wish. Tommen fiddled with his fork. I don't want to be at odds with my own uncle. I never liked that my family fought within itself, especially after everything that happened with Tyrion and father. He trailed off, the lines of his face etched with boyish sorrow. Margaery squeezed his hand. We can handle Kevin. If he arrives, we'll host him graciously. House Tyrell does not wish to break the realm into further strife, and Kevin is known to be more reasonable than your mother. We may yet find a path forward that keeps a measure of peace between our families. She prayed that was true. Kevin Lannister, from all reports, was a practical man who cared deeply for the stability of the realm. He had been overshadowed by Tywin's monumental presence for years, but he carried some of the late Lord's sense for order and strategy. At least he was not as explosive as Cersei. Tommen set his fork aside and let out a breath, as if relieved. Thank you, Margaery. You always know how to make things seem calmer. She smiled. That's what I'm here for. Now, I suggest we finish our breakfasts and then attend to the day's business. I have petitioners lined up for you in the throne room, men and women who simply wish to appeal to the king about small injustices. These are precisely the matters that will show them you're a gentle and fair ruler. Would you like me to guide the session? His face brightened again. Yes, please. Loras cleared his throat politely. "If it pleases your grace, I shall look into some matters of the city watch. Their organization still needs refining, after the faith militant took too many liberties." Tommen consented with a nod, and Margaery cast her brother a grateful glance. They all had a role in mending King's Landing after Cersei's tyranny and the faith's overreach. The day at least seemed to promise progress. Within the hour, Margaery walked beside Tommen into the throne room. A hush fell over the court officials and the small folk who had gathered. These days, the small folk were not turned away so quickly at the gates. One by one, the petitioners would present themselves and their grievances to the king. Normally, such scenes were overshadowed by pomp, but Margaery had encouraged a simpler ceremony. She was mindful that if they lost themselves in the old Lannister habit of arrogance and intimidation, the city's goodwill might evaporate. Tommen climbed the steps of the Iron Throne, dwarfed by its towering mass of melted swords. The golden circlet on his brow glinted under the torchlight. Margaery stood at the base of the throne's dais, hands folded, a gentle guardian presence. Grand Maester Pycelle shuffled forward, clearing his throat. "Your Grace, the first petitioner is one Master Tevin, a tailor by trade." A middle-aged man stepped up, doffing his cap. He recounted how, under the faith's newly empowered bailiffs, he had been required to pay heavy tithes, leaving him unable to feed his apprentices. He begged the king for relief and for the restitution of his coin. Tommen looked uncertain, but Margaery leaned close enough to whisper a soft suggestion in his ear, careful not to appear domineering. Tommen nodded and spoke. "You shall have relief from excessive tithes. Present your case to the Master of Laws, Ser Loras Tyrell, and we will see that you are repaid what was taken unjustly." A round of murmured approval rose. The tailor's eyes shone with gratitude as he bowed and withdrew. Margaery suppressed a smile of satisfaction. One petitioner at a time, she thought, will show them the new tone of this reign. The next was a young woman who claimed her husband had been wrongly imprisoned by a corrupt Septon's men for failing to pray at the appointed hours. Margaery inwardly seethed at how petty and punitive the faith had become under the High Sparrow's moral absolutism. The occupant of the Iron Throne must never again let such power run unchecked. Tommen promised that a fair hearing would be granted, with the woman's husband released unless proper cause for his detention could be shown. That pattern continued for an hour, men and women telling stories of taxes, forced piety, or faith harassment. Tommen gave each a pledge of redress, guided subtly by Margaery's hushed counsel. The people, sensing the shift, appeared to grow more confident in the new order. Margaery observed them exchanging hopeful looks, as if King's Landing might finally be a city where justice was possible. Yet, behind the crowd, she could sense the tension of the High Sparrow's adherents, still present in corners of the hall. A half-dozen members of the faith militant were scattered among the watchers, some of them wearing sullen expressions. They might not be as brazen as before, but the faith had by no means vanished. Margaery breathed carefully, acknowledging that so long as the High Sparrow lived in the Great September, he and his loyalists would remain a threat, especially now that they had lost the open backing of the crown. At last, Pycelle declared a short recess. Tommen rose, stretching the stiffness from his legs. He was still small enough that the Iron Throne seemed to swallow him, so Margaery was quick to take his hand and guide him off the dais, to a side chamber where cool drinks waited. As they crossed the hall, a man's voice cut sharply through the hush. "Your Grace, have you cast aside the sanctity of the Seven? Is it your intention to allow sinners to roam free?" All eyes turned. One of the faith militant, a lean, sharp-faced man with a star-shaped scar burned into his forehead, stood at the edge of the crowd. A cudgel dangled from his belt. Several of his companions stirred, as if emboldened by his outburst. Ser Balman Byrsach, a member of the Kingsguard, stepped forward. "You speak out of turn. Show respect to the king." But the zealot pressed on, gaze blazing. "Respect belongs to the Seven. This so-called mercy the king offers is an affront to the justice of the gods. We heard no condemnation for abominations and vices, Will his grace explain why the crown no longer enforces pious conduct? Margaery felt Tommen tense. The old fear of confrontation flickered in his eyes. She squeezed his arm, silently urging him to remain calm. Then she lifted her voice in a measured tone, addressing the zealot directly. We do not spurn the gods. We only seek to ensure that men are not punished without fair cause. The faith militant lost the trust of the people by wielding fear where compassion was needed. The man sneered. What would a highborn lady know of true faith? For all your sweet words, House Tyrell stands accused of moral stain. We have not forgotten Ser Loras's alleged crimes, nor yours, my lady, for lying before the faith. Will justice for those sins be undone? A stir of unease rippled through the hall. Tommen's face reddened. Margaery saw his embarrassment that these allegations about her brother, and indeed about herself, were being thrown into his face publicly. She refused to shrink from it. Ser Loras answered your charges. The crown determined the faith's evidence was lacking and tainted by personal vendettas. Let us not dredge up old falsehoods. You are free to pray for us, for all men are sinners, but you are not free to intimidate his grace with your threats. The zealot's hand twitched near the cudgel. For an instant, Margaery thought he might do something foolhardy. Then Kingsguard stepped in, forming a wall of white cloaks. One hissed, "If you lift that weapon, your life is forfeit." A storm of expressions crossed the zealot's face. Finally, he spat on the marble floor. "You will face the god's wrath. That day will come." He whirled, shoving past the crowd, and the other sparrows followed him out, muttering curses under their breath. Murmurs buzzed in the hall. The small folk were used to seeing the faith militant speak with brazen authority. Many seemed shocked by how outnumbered the zealots now were, how precarious their position had become. Margaery glanced at Tommen, who was still rigid with apprehension. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Come, my king," she said quietly. "We'll take a short rest. No sense giving them more of a stage than they've stolen." He nodded shakily, and together they left for the side chamber. Once the doors were closed, Tommen let out a trembling breath. "They still hate us, don't they?" Margaery glanced at the guards, who took up positions by the walls, then softened her voice. "A portion of them does, yes. The High Sparrow and his loyal followers aren't going to yield their power easily. They see us as an obstacle to their brand of righteousness. But remember, a far larger portion of the city stands with you. The zealots have lost the fearsome backing Cersei gave them. Their grip is weakening." Tommen nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. I don't want more bloodshed." "Nor do we," Margaery said gently. "But we must be ready if the faith pushes us to it. Let's keep building trust with our people, so if the faith tries to spark a revolt, the city will not follow. Instead, they'll defend their king." He swallowed hard. "You're right." Then, after a moment, "Thank you. Sometimes I think, if you weren't here, I'd have no idea how to handle this." She brushed a stray curl back from his forehead. "That's what family is for, Tommen." He gave a small, grateful smile, and the tension in the room eased. By day's end, the typical bustle of the Red Keep returned. Margaery slipped away to the Solar, where she often met with her grandmother. Olenna Tyrell awaited her, perched on a cushioned seat near tall windows, tapping her cane in an impatient rhythm. The old woman's gaze flicked up the moment Margaery stepped inside. "Come, child," Olenna said, gesturing for the servants to withdraw. They obeyed swiftly, leaving the two Tyrell women alone. "I hear you had a little spat with one of the faith's rabble-rousers." Margaery sank into a chair opposite her grandmother. "They're still bold enough to provoke Tommen in public. We can't let that fester." Olenna sniffed. "Bold, yes, but do they have teeth? Cersei's mistake was letting them arm themselves in the first place. We've taken away her support, but these fanatics are like a nest of hornets. Even if you destroy half, the rest still sting." Margaery pressed her lips together, considering. "We can't simply butcher them, grandmother. That would ruin our standing with the small folk. They don't want another massacre in the streets." They've already known too many horrors. Olenna inclined her head in grudging acknowledgement. No, you're right, but keep a close watch. That lot will not fade quietly into the sunset. If they see an opportunity to dethrone you in favor of a puppet they can control, they'll take it. Margaery exhaled slowly. I know. For now, they're isolated in the Great September. Their attempt to hold Loras as a sinner blew up in their faces, and Cersei's fiasco with them turned the common people against them. Still, I do not underestimate their capacity for stirring moral panic. Olenna's mouth tightened. It'd be easiest if the High Sparrow were to vanish some night, never to be seen again. Her tone was dry, edged with the suggestion of unsavory solutions. But let us consider a more delicate approach first. Perhaps you can split his support by inviting moderate septons into the Red Keep. Wine them, dine them, show them we're not an evil tyranny. Then you'll have them in your pocket. The notion made Margaery smile wryly. I've already begun. The smaller septs in the city, especially those serving the orphans and the destitute, have been receiving extra alms from the crown. That sets them apart from the High Sparrow's strict circle. Gradually, they'll drift away from the Great September's influence. Olenna patted her cane in approval. Exactly. Sometimes you prune the vine gently, so the rotten branches fall away of their own accord. A much less dramatic approach than hacking the whole bush down. Then she paused, eyes narrowing. Now tell me about Kevan Lannister. Any news of his movements? Margaery crossed her legs, thinking. Only that he remains in the Westerlands. Some say he's trying to quell rumors that Lady Cersei was exiled forcibly. He wants the Lannister bannermen calm. We're expecting him to arrive eventually, though perhaps he's trying to see which way the wind blows before stepping foot in King's Landing. Olenna snorted. Coward. Still, we should prepare for a diplomatic dance. Kevan has enough sense to see that open war with us would tear the realm apart, especially with the Iron Bank hounding the crown's finances, the Targaryen girl rumored to be gathering armies in Essos, and the North still in chaos. But Lannisters are Lannisters. He'll want to salvage his family's dignity. Margaery rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the stone towers and red-tiled roofs. If he arrives peacefully, we can negotiate. Tommen is still a Lannister by name, as much as he is a Baratheon by the official story. There's no reason Kevan can't stand by his nephew. The alternative is civil war that neither side can afford. Olenna sighed. Let us hope for sense. And if sense fails him, we have the gold, and we have the people's love. That counts for a great deal. Margaery gave her grandmother a fond look. The Queen of Thorns, formidable as ever, had orchestrated cunning beyond measure to see the Tyrells rise. Margaery herself had taken that cunning and woven it with genuine kindness for the people, forging something new in King's Landing. If House Lannister decided to press a bloody conflict, they might find the cost far too high. As the days turned into weeks, word drifted in from other regions of Westeros. The Riverlands remained in turmoil, with rivermen still resenting the Lannisters and Freys who had overshadowed them after the Red Wedding. The Vale sat quiet under Lord Peter Baelish's manipulations, though Margaery heard only scraps of rumor about how the young Lord Robert Arryn was faring. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell held power, but there were whispers that some of his kin wanted vengeance for the murder of Princess Elia and her children years ago. Vengeance aimed at the Lannisters, chiefly. King's Landing itself drifted into a precarious calm. The Tyrell name carried weight in the city now. Thanks to Olenna's skillful distribution of coin, bread, and boons, most of the merchants, common folk, and many officials were at least passively in favor of Margaery's regency-like influence. Tommen was the king, of course, but any observer could see who truly guided the realm day to day. One late afternoon, Mace Tyrell, her father, barged into Margaery's solar with a mix of excitement and worry shining in his eyes. "Daughter, there's been a raven from my seat at Highgarden," he began as she stood to greet him. "We have news that Kevan Lannister will ride for King's Landing. He's days away, by the looks of it. He brings a small retinue of knights, no more than 100. Seems more like a show of courtesy than an invasion force." Margaery nodded, feeling her pulse quicken. "We expected this. 100 knights doesn't pose much threat to the city, not with the gold cloaks and our own men at hand. But he'll certainly try to make a statement. Where is he traveling from? From the west, but he's swung south, presumably so he can pass through the Reach's borders and gauge our reaction. Mace looked uncertain. He'll see that your hold on King's Landing stands firm. That alone might deter any belligerent stance. Margaery let out a measured breath. We'll greet him with all courtesy. He's family to Tommen, after all. Father, arrange a welcoming committee of Tyrell bannermen. Make it clear we respect him but aren't intimidated. We'll have the King's Guard attend as well. And we should meet him at the city gates. No sense letting him think we hide behind the walls. Mace puffed up, partly relieved that his daughter took the lead. Yes, an excellent idea. I shall see to the details. Once he was gone, Margaery sat again, turning her thoughts toward how best to handle Kevan's arrival. If Kevan was anything like his late brother Tywin, he'd be direct, wanting to re-establish Lannister dignity. But Kevan was not Tywin. He lacked that iron aura of absolute authority. Margaery believed he might be open to a compromise that allowed the Lannisters to save face while acknowledging that House Tyrell essentially dominated the capital. She also knew that if negotiations failed, Kevan could become a rallying point for any Lannister loyalists or disenchanted lords who missed the old regime. War had ravaged Westeros enough, but that seldom stopped new conflicts from flaring. She prayed it would not come to that. 3 days later, a long line of riders appeared on the horizon beyond the Gate of the Gods. The city guard announced Lord Kevan Lannister's approach. Margaery and her retinue of Tyrell knights waited under green silk banners, while a separate contingent of gold cloaks kept watch from the gate towers. Tommen stood at Margaery's side, wearing his crown and a red and gold cloak to honor his paternal lineage. He looked nervous but determined, as if steeling himself to face whatever accusations Kevan might bring. Kevan Lannister came at the head of the column, clad in well-polished armor etched with golden lions. At his side rode a handful of knights wearing Lannister colors, crimson cloaks, shining helms. Margaery searched Kevan's face as he drew near. She saw a man in his late 50s, with hair graying at the temples, a square jaw, and eyes that surveyed the scene with somber acuity. He dismounted, and Margaery stepped forward, inclining her head. Lord Kevan, welcome to King's Landing. The king has been expecting you. Tommen gave a slight, respectful bow, more personal than official. Uncle Kevan, he said, voice steady. Thank you for coming. Kevan's mouth pressed into a tight line. Your Grace. He dipped to one knee in a show of fealty, at least publicly acknowledging Tommen's kingship. Rising, he let his gaze pass over the lines of Tyrell knights. I trust the city is well? Much improved, Margaery said smoothly. We look forward to discussing matters of the realm with you. He nodded curtly. I see. Let us proceed, then. My men will accompany me to the Red Keep, if that is acceptable. Of course, she said, though she made a subtle signal to the gold cloaks to keep watch. Kevan was too prudent to attempt any overt violence here, but caution was always wise. They rode back through the city. Margaery and Tommen led the way in an open litter, Kevan riding beside them. As they passed through the streets, Margaery was gratified to hear cheers for Tommen, and not for the Lannisters specifically. Perhaps Kevan noticed. His expression remained neutral, but she could sense him taking in every detail. The cleanliness of the thoroughfares, the presence of Tyrell emblems on the watchmen's uniforms, the lowered cost of bread displayed at market stalls. All signs that House Tyrell, not House Lannister, was feeding the city. By the time they reached the Red Keep, a hush descended among their party. Kevan dismounted and was escorted to the Royal Solar for a private audience. There, Olenna and Mace Tyrell awaited with measured politeness. Loras stood by the far wall, arms folded, his expression carefully blank. Ser Kevan glanced at each face, then fixed his attention on Tommen, who took the seat of honor behind a broad table. Margaery stood by the king's shoulder. Kevan inclined his head again. Your Grace, I won't waste words. I've come to learn why my sister felt compelled to leave the city under such abrupt circumstances. Tommen's gaze flickered uncertainly to Margaery, then he answered in a soft tone. Mother caused difficulties. She armed the faith militant, and they began abusing their power. It led to unrest, and the people blamed her. She thought it best to remove herself from King's Landing. Kevin's eyes narrowed. That is one way to put it. The rumors in the West claim she was banished. Olenna stepped forward. Banished, exiled, retired, call it what you will. The city was on the brink of tearing itself apart thanks to her meddling. Perhaps you recall that fiasco with my grandson, Ser Loras, nearly executed on false charges. And the faith nearly imprisoned the king's own wife. Cersei Lannister had a hand in all of it. I imagine the crown's stability means as much to you as it does to us, Lord Kevin. Kevin's lips thinned. He stared at Olenna for a long beat, then gave a curt nod. I'm aware of the trouble with the faith. My sister took desperate measures. I do not excuse them. Still, I question whether sending her across the sea was necessary. Could we not have arrived at a more amicable arrangement within the family? Margaery kept her voice cool but respectful. She refused. She threatened King Tommen's authority by continuing to manipulate both the faith and the courtiers. We offered the choice, departure or trial. Her presence had become untenable. He let out a slow breath, absorbing that. Very well. And now, the shape of the realm concerns me. We have gold in the Westerlands, harvests in the Reach, the Martells waiting in Dorne, the Freys and Tully remnants vying in the Riverlands, and in the north. He paused, letting the unspoken chaos rest. In short, I come to see if House Lannister still has a place in this crown's future. Or has that place been ceded entirely to House Tyrell? A significant question. Margaery locked eyes with him. We do not seek to cut House Lannister out of the realm's governance. But it is only fair to note that King's Landing stands indebted to our coin and our provisions. We have made the city livable again after months of near strangulation. If you wish to see the crown prosper, we hope you will join us in supporting the king, rather than seeking to undermine him. Kevin studied Tommen for a long moment, as though trying to discern just how much the boy had truly had a hand in these changes. Margaery could see a flicker of paternal regret in Kevin's gaze. For all that Tommen was Kevin's nephew, the boy must feel distant to him. Even in the official genealogies, Tommen was to be recognized as a Baratheon, not a Lannister. Perhaps that stung Kevin's pride. Eventually, Kevin said, I want what's best for my nephew, and for the realm. If House Tyrell stands ready to maintain order, feed the populace, and meet the Iron Bank's demands, then I cannot in good conscience sabotage such stability. I do, however, wish to speak to the king privately on family matters. Olenna sniffed. The king is rarely alone. He is young, and his queen consort aids him in all decisions. I understand, Kevin said firmly, but family is family. If the king trusts me enough to grant a brief audience, I ask that courtesy. Margaery glanced at Tommen, who gave her a faintly pleading look. He wanted a chance to speak with his uncle. She relented with a nod. Of course, she said, a short audience. But the king's safety is paramount, so allow Ser Loras to remain within the chamber, if only to the side. We must keep up appearances. Kevin's expression flickered, but he bowed. So be it. With that, Olenna, Mace, and Margaery withdrew, leaving Tommen and Loras with Kevin in the solar. Margaery lingered in the corridor outside, acutely aware of the tension behind that closed door. Olenna tapped her cane lightly on the stone floor. Meddlesome Lannister, Olenna muttered. Still, it could be worse. He might have come with an army. Margaery nodded in agreement. He's more pragmatic than Cersei. Let's see if that pragmatism extends to letting us govern in peace. They waited in taut silence for some time, long minutes that stretched. Then the door opened, and Kevin stepped out, his expression a careful mask. Tommen followed, face flushed but not frightened. Loras emerged last, watchful. Kevin regarded Margaery. I thank you for permitting me that discussion. I've told His Grace that I wish to remain in King's Landing as the Lannister representative on his council, for a time at least. so I can see that the transition remains smooth. He has agreed. Are you amenable to this arrangement? A flicker of relief tugged at Margaery's heart. Better to have Kevin here, playing a cooperative role on the small council, than off in the Westerlands brewing war. She kept her expression poised. I see no objection, Lord Kevin. We welcome your input. If King Tommen finds it beneficial, then I am glad to have another loyal advisor. He dipped his head. Then we have an accord. Tommen mustered a small smile. Yes, Uncle Kevin can help us with matters of the treasury, too, as he used to do for Grandfather Tywin. Margaery curtsied gently, a gesture of courtesy that said, let the city witness a show of unity. We can attend to the formalities in the throne room soon, to mark this arrangement publicly if you wish. Kevin's gaze flicked around, from Margaery to Olenna and back to Tommen. That would be wise, he said. And then, let us see how best we can serve the realm together. Over the next weeks, Kevin Lannister settled into the Red Keep's routine, taking a seat on the small council as a nominal master of the treasury, a role Margaery had carefully left open. She already had her father Mace serving as master of ships, Loras as master of laws, and Olenna's influence overshadowed all. The newly vacant master of coin position, once Tyrion's domain, had been a point of contention, but Kevin's presence made it easier to placate Lannister interests. The council sessions were more civil than any Margaery had experienced under Cersei's rule. Kevin did not indulge in petty barbs or sabotage. He was direct, sometimes stiff, but always mindful of not driving the realm into more chaos. Margaery respected that, as did Olenna, though the Queen of Thorns still let slip the occasional cutting remark. In truth, Kevin's cooperation brought a sense of equilibrium. The Lannisters, though humbled, still had a voice. The Tyrells, ascendant, guided Tommen's policy with an eye toward peace and prosperity, not petty vengeance. Meanwhile, the faith militant simmered. The High Sparrow continued to preach ascetic discipline and threaten dire punishments for those who sinned without repentance. However, without royal backing or gold, his capacity to enforce these threats waned. Some of the more zealous sparrows still roamed Flea-Bottom, but the gold cloaks, bolstered by Tyrell support, kept a firmer grip on the streets. A few ugly incidents flared up when drunken faith militant members tried to drag alleged sinners into the sept, but the City Watch intervened each time. The High Sparrow sent messages protesting the Crown's oppression of holy justice, but he received only measured replies. If he had evidence of crimes, let him present it through proper legal channels, as any subject of the king must. By degrees, the faith's self-proclaimed authority eroded. One crisp morning, as autumn's chill began to creep over the city, Margaery accompanied Loras on a survey of the lower wards. They traveled incognito, just a pair of well-dressed nobles with a small escort, hoping to see firsthand how the people fared. Loras wore a cloak of deep green, pinned with a gold rose. Margaery likewise kept her attire refined but not ostentatious, so as not to appear aloof. They visited a baker who told them that, thanks to the Tyrell grain supply, she was able to sell loaves at half last year's price. Across the street, a blacksmith explained that business had improved once the city stabilized. Fewer brawls meant less repair of battered helms, yet with the roads safer, traders now came in with raw materials for him to forge. At each stop, Margaery offered a gracious word, a promise of continued support from the king's coffers. She and Loras found the mood generally hopeful, more so than King's Landing had known in many a year. But as they turned into a narrow lane on the edge of Flea-Bottom, a hush fell among the small folk. At first, Margaery thought it was simply the usual reaction to seeing well-born visitors in a poor district. Then she saw a young woman kneeling on the dirt, tears streaking her face, clutching the limp body of a small child. Bystanders circled uncertainly, some muttering prayers. What happened here? Loras asked a nearby man. The man's expression was grim. Child wasted away from a fever, M-Lord. No maester in this part of the city. The Septons used to come with herbal cures, but not these days. The High Sparrow told them to tend only to those who show penance. Margaery's heart twisted. She stepped closer. The grieving mother stared up with hollow eyes, as if pleading for someone, anyone, to help. But it was clearly too late. The child's face was pale, lips blue. Margaery went to her knees, heedless of the dirt, and pressed a gentle hand to the woman's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," Margaery murmured. "Let me see if there's anything we can do. Perhaps a proper resting place." The mother sobbed. "He was only 5. No septon would come. Said we had no coin, so we must atone. I can't even bury him in the ground the faith claims as holy." Margaery closed her eyes against the surge of sorrow and anger. She had improved the city's overall conditions, but tragedies like this still abounded in Flea Bottom. Disease, poverty, the callous neglect of the faith. She looked at Loras, who wore an expression of appalled sympathy. "We'll see to it he's buried honorably," she said gently. "In the city graveyard by the Mudgate, if you wish. The king's men will dig the grave, and a blessing will be said. We'll find a septon willing to do it, I promise." The mother's eyes brimmed with tears. She could hardly speak, just clutched Margaery's hand in gratitude. A bitter taste filled Margaery's mouth. Clearly, the High Sparrow's brand of charity had left families like this to fend for themselves. Despite all her efforts, the city's poorest still slipped through the cracks. She felt a renewed determination to address the problem. Perhaps it meant establishing free clinics or paying for more maesters to be stationed in the city's wards, or forging alliances with the moderate septons who would actually bring healing. One child's life was already lost, but how many more could be saved? She stood, placed a silver stag in the mother's trembling hand, and told Loras to see that the child was given an immediate, decent burial. The bystanders watched with soft murmurs of approval. When Margaery finally walked away, tears threatened to well in her own eyes. She steadied her breath, reminding herself that she was a queen consort now, one who had power to do more than simply feel sorrow. She intended to use that power. That evening, back in the Red Keep, Margaery convened a meeting of the small council. The king presided at the table, Kevan Lannister to his right, Mace Tyrell to his left, with Olenna, Loras, and Pycelle present. Margaery stood so she could address them easily, with Tommen's nod of approval. "The city suffers a deficit of medical care," she began. "Maesters from the Citadel are too few in number for a population as large as King's Landing. The faith should be providing healing, but the High Sparrow has chosen to focus on punishment and penance. Therefore, we must step in. I propose the Crown fund new infirmaries across the poorer wards, staffed by traveling hedgemaesters or trained midwives who know the healing arts." Pycelle sputtered, "But my lady, the cost. The Crown is already deeply in debt to the Iron Bank. How can we afford such new expenses?" Margaery inclined her head. "We can restructure some of the budgets previously used for faith donations, money that was set aside under the old arrangement. We now have less reason to appease the Great September financially, so those funds can be channeled into direct assistance for the people." Olenna raised a brow, glancing at Kevan. "We might also secure a loan from the Tyrell coffers if needed. The shipments of grain and produce from the Reach are turning a tidy profit in the markets. The question is whether the Lannisters would prefer to match or supplement that loan, to ensure the burden is shared fairly." Kevan sat stony-faced for a moment, then nodded once. "If it will stabilize the city and prevent plague or unrest, yes. I can speak to my bannermen about a contribution. The Lannisters, after all, do not benefit from a starving, diseased capital." Tommen brightened, clearly relieved at the cooperation. "Thank you, Uncle. Grand Maester Pycelle, can you write to the Citadel and request more trained healers? Hedgemaesters, acolytes, or anyone fit for medical practice. Emphasize that the Crown will pay them fairly." Pycelle harumphed. "I shall do so, Your Grace, though the Citadel can be slow to respond, especially with winter on its way. But I will make it clear that King Tommen's must not be delayed." Margaery flicked her gaze around the table. "In the meantime, I'd like to see if we can redirect some skilled midwives and healers already in King's Landing to these new infirmaries. I'll speak with the Guild of Midwives. Loras can coordinate the building sites with the Master of Works. Let us not wait for the Citadel's possible approval. A series of nods rippled around the council. Then Kevin cleared his throat. I have another matter to raise, rumors from the north. Word is spreading that there's friction between the Boltons in Winterfell and the remnants of House Stark supporters. Some say a bastard rumored to be Ned Stark's son is rallying wildlings at the Wall. Others claim a young boy named Rickon Stark has been located. We don't know which rumor is true, if any, but the North is restless. Margaery considered the news. With the War of the Five Kings having quieted in the south, the North remains the largest wild card. The Boltons may have declared loyalty to King Tommen, but their methods have made them despised. If the North truly unites behind a surviving Stark, they might repudiate Tommen entirely. Kevin tapped his fingers on the table. Precisely. If the North breaks away, it further weakens the Iron Throne's authority. Once, we had the Tyrells and Lannisters united behind the crown, plus the support of the Freys in the Riverlands. But that alliance stands on fragile ground after the Red Wedding fiasco. If the North rebels effectively, we risk renewed war. Mace Tyrell coughed, glancing at Margaery. He had the faintly uneasy expression of a man out of his depth. Do we intervene? Send an army north to put down any rebellion? The crown might not have the appetite for a new campaign, but it might be necessary to keep the realm together. Margaery frowned. Another war would be disastrous, especially one waged in winter conditions. Before we speak of armies, perhaps we can attempt diplomacy. If there is a legitimate Stark heir, we could offer them terms. A seat on the King's Council or wardship in the south, or recognition of certain northern rights. Something to keep them from waging open rebellion. The North has bled enough. We all have. Olenna gave a curt nod of approval. Sensible. The last thing we need is half the realm rising in revolt. A well-placed marriage or betrothal might also smooth things over, though we're running short on unmarried royals. She cast a pointed glance at Tommen and Margaery. Though, perhaps a match for one of the younger Tyrell cousins? Tommen nodded thoughtfully, though a hint of confusion crossed his features. He was still so young to be hearing talk of forging alliances through betrothals. Margaery took pity on him. Let's see if we can learn more about the North situation first. If a Stark child truly lives, we need to know who and where. The last we heard, Sansa Stark's whereabouts were uncertain, and Arya was presumed dead or missing. Bran and Rickon were rumored dead, but rumors swirl in every direction. Let's gather intel. Kevin exhaled. I'll send a raven to our contact near Moat Cailin. Meanwhile, I suggest we keep an eye on the Boltons' communications. If Roose Bolton or his bastard son, Ramsay, feels threatened, they may do something rash. Loras spoke up, voice low. If the Boltons provoke open chaos, it could embolden the faith militant here to say that the king's rule is cursed. We must move carefully. Stability in the North means stability for all. Margaery glanced at the king. Tommen's youthful features were set in firm concentration. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We will handle this, Your Grace. One step at a time. The realm needs your measured judgment. He gave a shy smile, grateful for her confidence. Thank you, Margaery, he said softly, then raised his voice to the council. Let us do what we can to keep the peace. We've had enough war. As the crisp autumn air grew colder, King's Landing took on a paradoxical atmosphere of uneasy calm. Merchants bustled, the small folk chattered about the new infirmaries opening in Flea Bottom, and Tyrell guards patrolled with relative politeness compared to the old Lannister men. Kevin maintained a reserved presence, advising Tommen mostly on matters of finance and occasionally on how to handle the Iron Bank's demands for repayment. Olenna teased that, in time, Kevin might come to appreciate a city that functioned smoothly, a far cry from the chaos Cersei had courted. Yet Margaery felt the undercurrents shifting. Rumors from Essos multiplied. Daenerys Targaryen had freed cities across Slaver's Bay, commanded dragons grown large enough to be lethal. Some sailors claimed she prepared a massive fleet to cross the narrow sea. Others said she was bogged down quelling rebellions among her freedmen. No one knew for certain, but if a Targaryen queen with living dragons ever landed in Westeros, The tenuous alliances they'd built here might be tested to the breaking point. On a personal level, Margaery found her days increasingly full. She juggled the daily tasks of ruling, petitions, finances, edicts, with her philanthropic efforts, such as expanding the network of midwives and herbalists. She also worked to keep Tommen steadily guided, teaching him how to greet lords and how to weigh their petitions, how to appear confident even when uncertain. In private, she still cherished small, quiet moments with him, reading stories, walking in the keep's gardens, knowing that she might be the closest thing to a true maternal figure he had left, especially with Cersei gone and Myrcella in Dorne. In the back of her mind, Margaery could not ignore the possibility that Cersei might someday return, forging alliances across the sea, or perhaps seeking the Golden Company's assistance with Lannister gold. But each passing day made that less likely. Cersei's letters, if any, did not arrive at the Red Keep. She had effectively vanished, presumably fuming in some free city. Margaery took small comfort in that. One afternoon, she found herself in the garden courtyard, where a row of potted rose bushes flanked the path. Loras was practicing sword forms with a young squire at the far side, while Margaery sat on a stone bench reading a missive from an acolyte of the citadel. The letter confirmed that a handful of novices would travel to King's Landing to aid in the new infirmaries. It was a small success. The gentle scrape of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Kevan Lannister stood there, hands folded behind his back. She rose, mustering a polite smile. "My lord," she said, "I did not expect you here. How may I help you?" He inclined his head. "I merely wish to walk in the gardens. My brother Tywin never had much regard for such pursuits, but I find a short stroll can clear the mind. May I sit?" She gestured to the bench. Of course. They sat, the fragrance of roses drifting around them. Margaery noticed how Kevin's gaze flickered to Loras, still deep in sword practice. She wondered if he would bring up the old charges about Loras's private life. But the older man seemed more contemplative than disapproving. Eventually, he cleared his throat. "I wanted to say, I see that King's Landing is truly improved under your guidance, Lady Margaery. It's not only Tyrell gold, but your personal efforts. The bread for the poor, the infirmaries, the careful listening to the small folks' grievances. It's not how Cersei would have ruled." She folded her hands in her lap. "Thank you for noticing. We do our best to avoid cruelty when a gentler approach will suffice. The city has been battered by war, riots, tyranny. People need a reason to trust the crown again." He nodded. "Yes." A shadow passed over his features. "Cersei once told me years ago that fear was the only means to keep power. She said we should let them hate so long as they fear. That was a teaching she inherited from her experiences. I see now that your approach draws loyalty through kindness. It's a different tactic, but not necessarily weaker." Margaery sensed the weight in his tone, the regret of a man who had watched his niece descend into paranoia and cruelty. She thought carefully before replying. "There is a balance between kindness and strength, my lord. No realm survives without the capacity to defend itself. But if all one does is punish, one eventually rules over nothing but ashes." He ran his hand over the bench's edge. "Indeed." Then, in a softer voice, he added, "I only wish the Lannisters could have learned that lesson earlier. Perhaps we'd have fewer enemies." Margaery studied his face. "It's not too late to mend old rifts. If you remain here, we can show the realm that House Lannister and House Tyrell stand together for a stable future, one that sets aside some of the grudges from the War of the Five Kings." He sighed. "I pray so, for Tommen's sake if nothing else." Across the courtyard, Loras disarmed his squire with a smooth flourish, then set down his blade. He waved in their direction, politely acknowledging Kevan, who inclined his head in return. Margaery felt that subtle tension, but also an acceptance in Kevan's demeanor that would have been unthinkable under Cersei's reign. The city might never fully forget the cruelty of the Lannisters, but perhaps, with Kevan's aid, they could forge a more peaceful capital. Yet beneath the surface of daily governance, Margaery Tyrell knew they all walked a razor's edge. The faith could still stir chaos. The Iron Bank demanded the crown's debts be repaid. The north rumbled with rumors of rebellion. And across the narrow sea, a dragon queen might or might not sail for Westeros with fire and blood. For every child saved from sickness in Flea Bottom, another might succumb to winter's chill. For every handshake of alliance extended to a Lannister, a dagger might be sharpened in the shadows by an aggrieved faction. Still, she pressed on. She oversaw Tommen's education, taught him how to address letters to the lords of each region, how to phrase royal commands with tact. She visited the new infirmaries as they sprang up in the city's poorest districts, comforting mothers, listening to the whispered pleas of the ill. She arranged for discreet sums of coin to be sent to war widows, forging loyalty where cynicism had once reigned. Each day, she sealed cracks in the realm's foundation with a mixture of steel and compassion. Steel in her resolve, compassion in her dealings with the people. Often, she found herself remembering the day in the Great September when it all turned, when she rallied the crowd against the faith's injustice and forced Cersei's hand. That memory stood as a testament to the power of the people's love, outweighing even the fear that the High Sparrow and Cersei had tried to stoke. It reminded her that the best bulwark against enemies within the city was not a legion of armed men, but the hearts of the citizens themselves. If they believed in her, if they believed in King Tommen, no amount of zealotry would take root. Late one evening, she stood again on the ramparts, the same vantage from which she had watched over the city after Cersei's departure. The night sky glittered with stars, and a faint glow of lanterns showed King's Landing's winding streets below. Somewhere, an infant's cry echoed. Elsewhere, raucous laughter spilled from a tavern near the mud gate. Life pulsed through the city, no longer overshadowed by the oppressive hush that once lingered in every alley. Margaery closed her eyes, breathing in the cool air. She thought of the future, of the possibility that one day she and Tommen might have a true child of their own, an heir to the throne, one not tainted by the stigma of Lannister incest or rumored Baratheon illegitimacy. She thought of how House Tyrell might secure peace if they extended a hand north, or perhaps found a way to treat with Dorne more respectfully than the Lannisters ever had. She thought of old alliances that might be rekindled or new ones forged, ensuring that the wars of the past did not reignite. Yet she also remembered that the Game of Thrones was never truly over. Cersei might be gone, but others would rise to test Margaery's hold. The High Sparrow was one threat, unrest in the north was another, and beyond the sea, dragons could someday fill the sky. It was not in Margaery's nature to be naive. She understood that a queen consort's greatest advantage lay in reading each shift of fortune before it arrived. A faint step on the stone behind her caught her attention. She turned to see Loras approaching, hands clasped. He wore a subdued expression, though he managed a small smile at her questioning look. "I thought I might find you here," he said softly. She tipped her chin toward the city. "It helps to remind myself who I serve. Not just the lords in the Red Keep, but those thousands of souls out there." He joined her at the battlement, gazing down. "You've done well by them, Margaery. Far better than most who sit in power. I hope they realize that." She sighed. "I think many do, but in these times, hopes can be dashed in an instant. I don't intend to let that happen. Not again." He reached out, squeezed her hand. She remembered the boyish knight he'd been. A golden youth, carefree at Renly's side, before war and politics had tarnished his innocence. She saw in his eyes a new kind of determination, tempered by adversity. Perhaps neither of them were as idealistic as when they first came to King's Landing, but they retained a spark of something kinder than the typical cutthroat ways of the court. "You'll hold this city in your palm," he said. "It's strange to think how quickly you rose from bride to Joffrey, then bride to Tommen, enduring Cersei's scorn, the faith's accusations. And now, it's your reign that shapes the capital." She pressed her lips together. "Our reign, Loras. You stand beside me and grandmother and father. We didn't do this alone. The small folk themselves played the largest part when they refused to be bullied any longer. We only had to give them the chance." He smiled, a bit wry. "That's true. Still, I'm glad you led them. Without you, they might never have found the courage. I, for one, am proud of you." Gratitude and affection welled within her. They stood in companionable silence for a time, gazing over the city they had fought so hard to save from cruelty and chaos. The wind carried the faint clang of a distant smith's hammer, the low hum of thousands of voices. It reminded Margaery of a garden at dusk, full of small, rustling sounds as living things found their place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as always. But for tonight, Margaery let herself relish a moment of peace, remembering the glow of torches and the feel of the cool breeze. She remembered the child she had tried to save that morning in Flea Bottom. Too late, but maybe, with more effort, the next child would live. She thought of the old adage that growing a garden required both sunshine and storms, that the strongest roses were those that had been pruned. Whatever storms might come, she resolved, she would see this city bloom. Above her, the stars shone bright, as if in silent benediction. And below, King's Landing breathed in a night without fear of the lioness in the Red Keep, without the faith's cudgels at every corner. The rose of Highgarden had taken root. If the gods were good, it would flourish not just for a season, but for years to come.